In this unit, we discuss incident response team policies. Most larger organizations would probably have or need an incident response team or have policies surrounding incident response. And of course, you can't really have policies defining incident response if there's nobody responsible to actually handle those incidents. So we talk a little bit about some policies that you would develop to authorize an incident response team and what that incident response team would be doing. So basically what their charter is. And all this would, of course, be defined ahead of time in your incident response team policies. So what is an incident? One of the important things in defining an incident response team and trying to define what their authority is explaining exactly what an incident is, what they're responsible for. So an incident can be a number of things. A couple examples from your book. Any event that violates security policies. So, and that's pretty broad, but you've gone through the exercise of creating all these policies. So anything that violates those policies could be considered an incident. Now, of course, things that are minor, you probably wouldn't consider you wouldn't actually spawn the incident response team for minor infractions of the policies. But again, that's something that we have to define in that incident response team policy. So examples of things that we would activate our incident response team: unauthorized access to data. So if we find out that somebody got access to the data, this could be from an insider, this could be somebody from outside the network. Another example, unauthorized modification of data. So somebody changed the data. And again, this could come from somebody either inside or from outside the organization. Disruption of service. So if something's happening that the network services are going offline or servers are no longer accessible, email is down, these could have broad implications in some businesses. So that would be considered a major incident. So some types of incidents, and this is from our textbook. Our textbook breaks down incidents. One of the first things that you have to do when you're developing an incident response policy is define categories for these incidents. So, and depending on what category an incident falls in, is going to dictate how that incident is going to get handled, or what the specific policies are for that incident, who gets notified, how the incident response team, coordinates things. So it is helpful to try to categorize these incidents. In our book, it gives you, there's two different methods that they use, for categories, but the three of them overlap in both, so I'll just give you all five here. The first type would be malicious code attacks. The second type would be denial of service. The third is unauthorized access or theft of data, network reconnaissance probe, and inappropriate usage. So I explain all these. Malicious code attack would be somebody finding a virus or a virus that's attacking the network. So something along those lines would be a malicious code attack. So it's any code such as viruses, worms, Trojan horses, scripts that are used to gain access to systems, applications, and data. A denial of service attack is an incident that causes networks or computers to cease operating. So a denial of service attack can make it seem as though the network is down. And it's a certain type of attack. It gets its own category. So unauthorized access and theft is pretty obvious. That's when somebody who's not authorized to access information breaches security to get access to that data. So some kind of security breach where somebody gets access to data. And then network reconnaissance is when software is run, somebody runs software that tries to determine all of the security weaknesses on your network. So it looks for all the open ports. It tries to fingerprint those open ports to figure out what operating system each host is running, what services are running on all the hosts, what versions. And there are patterns that these software tools have. So Nmap, things like that. They have certain patterns that you can detect in an intrusion detection system. So if you detect that somebody is doing that, that could spawn an incident that maybe the incident response team has to look at. Obviously, that would indicate that somebody is trying to attack your network. Of course, you can't do that every single time. I think most of us know that, in most cases, these, port scanners and things are running on the internet all the time. People are constantly port scanning your public IP addresses. I know in our firewall logs, we see it all the time. We see it all day long. So we can't really, we don't really worry about that, network reconnaissance from that sense. However, if we see something like that happening inside our network, that's a completely different story. That would spawn some kind of an incident response, because if that network probe is happening inside the network, that means there's somebody inside the building, or somebody who is inside our network is trying to probe for weaknesses. It could be as simple as an employee installing some software tool that that probes the network, but that's certainly something to be looked at, and certainly would want to question the motives of somebody who's installing software like that on the network. Why are they trying to look for all the open ports and what all the different versions are? Especially, if it's somebody in the network team, or if it's somebody in IT, it would make sense. But, if it's somebody on the front line, maybe it doesn't make sense that they're installing a tool like that. So they might have some malintent. And then finally, inappropriate usage, which would be any unacceptable use of a computer, such as copying illegal software, making statements via email or text message that are inappropriate. So somebody sends inappropriate images to other employees or to customers, or things like that. So just any inappropriate usage. The first four in your book are the book got those from the PCI standard, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which we talked about before. So they're pretty generic. The one that I added on the bottom there, that comes from the FISMA or NAST standards. So, in government and in private business, inappropriate usage is something that's important that we have to look at. But in respect to, financial transactions, in general, then inappropriate usage wouldn't be so important. But I think in most of our cases, I think all of these would be important to just about any organization. So any of these would trigger our incident response team. So let's talk more about the incident response team and what they do. So an incident response team is the group that is responsible for coordinating the reaction to something that is a declared incident. And what is a declared incident? That's something you're going to define in your IT security policy. So you would define in your policy any incident that would qualify to involve the incident response team. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But what exactly is the incident response team? What makes up an incident response team? So an incident response team is, in our textbook, they talk about it being a cross-functional team. Cross-functional meaning that that it involves a lot of people that have different skill sets. So you bring all these different skill sets to the table in an incident response team by combining lots of different people in the organization from different departments. So you might bring together, multiple different departments, with each person having some kind of expertise within that department. And it doesn't even have to be IT. These could be people that know how the data is used, and they know the ramifications of an incident. So, for example, I work in mostly medical, and if you had somebody in the laboratory department on the incident response team, they might know that if somebody were to breach the systems that they use for, well, I'll use a better example, pharmacy. If somebody were to breach the pharmacy department, they would know if that would cause the wrong medications to get prescribed to patients, or they could tell if the purpose of the attack is to try to get the medications dispensed for which somebody should not be getting. You'd be surprised how far people go to try to get painkillers and things like that, and other drugs. So, even though they're not IT people, they certainly have something to bring to the team. So you bring together all these different people, and they all kind of know the ramifications of everything. When I think of an incident response team in IT, you can almost think of it as, I think most cities have these now, where you've got these cross-functional groups that, the incident response teams for public safety. So if there's a big hurricane coming or a huge snowstorm, you'll see on the news where they have these, these teams of, this big room where the fire chief is there, the police chief is there, the mayor is there, the department of, the water department and the roads department, all these different departments that probably ordinarily don't sit in the same room. They go to some kind of control center, and they all sit together so they can coordinate with one another. And that's kind of what an incident response team in IT is for as well. So all these people sit together, and or not necessarily have to sit together, but they're working together when there is an incident. And of course, it's going to make things a lot faster, a lot smoother, and they can interface a little bit better. So the incident response team just kind of formalizes that. So just like in the when you look at any city's incident response team to major events or calamities, there's usually there's probably somebody coordinating all that, so some kind of emergency coordinator that's sort of calling the shots, and pulling everyone together. And it's not necessarily the mayor. It could be somebody that's their specialty. If you ever watch, I'm trying to remember the name of the movie, but there was a movie about a volcano erupting in Los Angeles back in the 90s, and the star of the movie, that was his job. He was the emergency coordinator, and his job was to basically coordinate all the different city services in the event of a major emergency or a major calamity hitting the city. And the other piece to that is not only the somebody who coordinates all that, but also some kind of framework that codifies all that into some kind of formal document or formal procedure. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So again, it's a cross-functional team. Our book talks about that. It's organized and coordinated, as I just explained. So there's some kind of a structure to this incident response team. It's not just a bunch of people that get together every once in a while. There's some kind of a structure to this. Everybody knows what their role is. Everyone knows what their responsibilities are when there's an incident. And like I said, they're all going to have different skills. We have to make sure, cross-functional, when I talked about that, about different departments, but we also have to have various IT skills that we can bring to bear in the incident that are part of that incident response team. Usually our incident response team is only going to respond to major incidents. As I said before, they can't respond to every little minor infraction of policies. I talked about what is an incident, and I said anything that violates a policy or anything that goes against our written policy for IT security. But that could be simple things like somebody using a password that's too short, or somebody accessing files on the wrong file server, or something like that. Something that's minor with no malicious intent and really not a lot of damage. Certainly things that need to get addressed and that you need to enforce, but should not spawn the entire incident response team. Just because somebody had the wrong password or something like that, or somebody tried to log in and failed and forgot their password. That would not launch the or trigger the incident response team. So all of that has to get defined in your IT security policy for incident response teams. It has to define when the IRT is actually activated. So minor incidents are normal operations. So that should all be addressed in your regular policies, how to handle those minor incidents and whether or not there's enforcement and things like that. So who makes up our incident response team? In our book, they talk about a bunch of different kinds of people that might make up our incident response team. The first is SMEs, which stands for subject matter expert. So these are the IT subject matter experts or departmental subject matter experts, and they bring an intimate knowledge of various systems and configurations, and they know intimately how their department or their information systems work. So a DBA, for example, is going to know how the database works and what's in the database and what affects the database. Somebody else who might be a data user in a certain department might know how they use that data and how to interact with the vendor maybe that supports that system. So that might be an example of an SME that's brought in. You might also have IT or IS security representatives, so people that have the risk management skills, analytical skills for IT security. They're going to look at the evidence. They're going to try to understand the security ramifications of an incident. You would have HR, which would be involved. One of the problems with IT security, we talked about this before, is something like 40% of all IT security incidents happen from the inside. So a lot of these security breaches and a lot of the incidents, maybe not the majority, but an awful lot of them are going to involve employees within the organization. So HR would need to be involved to know how to deal with those employees. Is there discipline? Do they just do some employee counseling, things like that? You would obviously need to have some legal representative on the incident response team. And the legal people are there for a few reasons. Number one, they can verify that you're complying with the regulations even during an incident. So sometimes if an incident is happening, you have to know who you have to not notify. So sometimes you're required by law to notify certain entities depending on what type of business you're in. For example, I'm in healthcare, and if there's a data breach on patient information, we have to notify the Department of Health and Human Services, and we also have to notify the patients that are affected by that data breach. So legal counsel can say, okay, this is the point that we now have to notify either DHHS or we have to notify our patients. The other thing about legal counsel is, in most organizations, you don't want to deal with law enforcement directly as an employee. And I know that sounds crazy. We're all brought up to, that we should run to the police for help, right? We all tell our kids, if you're in trouble, go to the police. But when we become adults, we know that it's not that simple. One piece of advice that any lawyer will tell you is never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, ever talk to the police without a lawyer. And that's not just to protect the bad guys, but that's to protect innocent people as well. And also, I think good police probably appreciate, the fact that it's somebody who understands the law that they can communicate with, especially when we're talking about incidences at this level. So it's generally not a good idea to talk to the law or talk to law enforcement without using a lawyer, without using some kind of legal counsel. So in many cases, you're going to want to have some kind of legal representative. It could be somebody on retainer, a local law firm that's on retainer if you're not that big of an organization. I think many organizations already have, either somebody who's inside, an internal legal counsel, or there may be some firm that you outsource to, but they would be, you would have some kind of procedure to say, when we talk to the police or when we talk to the FBI, that's who we go through. And that's something I think they talk about in IT security classes a lot, that if somebody breaks into your network and steals a bunch of data, if there's no reason to notify law enforcement, you may have suffered some kind of a loss, right? Let's say we lost a bunch of intellectual property, right? Somebody broke in the network and stole some intellectual property. It didn't affect our customers, but it did affect our business, and it did, and maybe we do suffer some kind of loss from that. But one of the problems that you might have is that you go to law enforcement because you think, they're going to help me. And you say, hey, somebody broke in and stole a bunch of information from our servers. The first thing law enforcement is going to do is show up and take all your servers. And then you don't have anything, right? Because they came in and took all your equipment and your infrastructure. So certainly something to think about. I would never advocate hiding something from the police, but it's sort of like if I get into a minor car accident, there's no reason for me to call the police to write a police report if I'm in a minor car accident. I can just deal with that with the person that I had the accident. No use in wasting the police time, and no use in having a police report written up and having it go on both of our records if we're willing to work it out together with our insurance companies. So, certainly something to be said for that. So some other folks you might want to have involved in, and this goes back to the legal stuff, is public relations. And this would basically be the folks that are going to be interacting with the public during an incident. So if there is a major incident and it affects customers, you're going to want somebody who can talk to the customers and somebody who can talk to, any government authorities or anything like that. Perfect example is, a major website, like, let's say if you use Gmail and Gmail goes down, the silence is probably the worst thing. When, you're trying to access your email, you can't get to it, and nobody's telling you anything. So it's a good idea to inform your users as to what's going on, but you want to do that in a controlled way. You want to make sure the message is consistent, right? You don't want different people saying different things. I know Google used to have that problem when Gmail went down back in the old days, about 10 years ago. You would go to blogs for employees of Google, and they would all be saying something different about when it was going to be back online. There was no consistent message from Google about what was happening and when you were going to get your mail back. So certainly something to be said for consistency. So that's another piece. So after PR, we have BCR, which is Business Continuity Representative. So this would be the person who understands the organization's capability to restore the systems and applications. And again, this all goes back to policy. So somebody would know what that process is, and what the effects are on the data that's affected by an incident. We'd also have data owners. These are the people that understand the data and the business. So as I said before, as far as being a cross-functional team, you're not just going to have IT people. You're going to have people that understand the data and the processes within the organization. And then finally, management. And management kind of has a couple things. Number one, they're the key decision maker. So they're the ones that if there's a major decision to be made, that you're going to escalate it to management. It's good to have a go-to person in management you can do that with. In the heat of the moment with a major incident, you don't want to be tracking down, who can make this decision. So, somebody who can basically be on standby to say, hey, what should we do? We've got a couple different options here. As an example, one of the decisions that you have to make in an incident is, do we prevent or do we lock down the attack just to start protecting ourselves right away? Or do we continue to let them through the network, through our safeguards so we can try to track them and find out who they are? Especially if it's an insider, you want to see, okay, where is this coming from? So we know who we need to go after. So a management person could make that decision to say, you know what, it's not worth the risk. Let's just cut this off right now. Or they might say, you know what, it's worth the risk if we can catch this, whoever's perpetrating the attack and allow it to continue to happen. When you form this team, this incident response team, they have to have a charter. Most businesses require, and organizations are going to want some kind of a charter, which a charter is basically a formal document that authorizes some new group or some procedure or process or what have you. So in IT, for an incident response team in IT, we would do the same thing. Our charter would clearly state the mission of the incident response team. What are they going to be doing? What are their goals? Maybe the goals would be to reduce the number of incidents, reduce the amount of theft, and as far as IT, intellectual property and things like that. It would establish their authority to say, here's a group of people, their authority is to do X, Y, and Z. In this case, it would be to step in the event of an incident. So everybody knows, okay, these are the guys that are calling the shots when we have a major incident. In our book, they talk about a couple different approaches to establishing an incident response team, and you have to decide which of these approaches you're going to take before you start formalizing all these policies and even this charter document. And the three are, the first is on-site incident response team. So an on-site incident response team has full authority to contain a breach. So they're the ones that are actually, pushing buttons on the keyboard. They're the ones sitting in front of workstations, and they're doing the work. So, they're there. They're IT people. They're intimately involved with what's happening. They're probably, I think in most cases, an incident response team are not, you wouldn't have somebody who's dedicated just to incident response unless you have a really big organization that you can justify that. There's enough incidents that you need that, but this would basically be an incident response team. They're all local. They're all there. They know what they're doing. The other possibility is the incident response team having a supporting role. So they're basically in the background. You've still, you might have your system administrators actually doing the work, but the IRT is saying, hey, this is what we should be doing. We should be locking down the database. We should delete these user accounts. We should, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be a supporting role. And then the third one is coordination. So this is where the IRT is not so much telling anybody what to do. They're rather kind of calling everyone together, saying, okay, let's talk. Let's figure out what we need to do to contain this attack. So they may not be, experts in IS, security, but, they're going to bring everybody. You can think almost like a project manager, bringing these disparate groups together and making sure that they're doing what they need to do, and sort of being the referee, saying, okay, let's get this done. So you have to decide which of these three you're going to use, or which of these approaches that you're going to take for your incident response team before you can write your mission and before you can form your team and really define what their authority is. Obviously, the authority of the IRT is going to be a little different depending on whether it's on site, a supporting role, or in a coordination role. In order to form our incident response team, like I said, we're going to develop that charter based on what I just told you. We're going to decide on that approach. So determine which of those IRT models or which approach we're going to take, the on-site, the supporting, or the coordinating role. We're going to set some goals. Example, response time. How fast is the incident response team going to get coordinated and get together and start working on an incident? We're going to identify all the team members. So we're going to say maybe it's not specifically identified. It could also be, identified by position. Whoever holds the following position is by default a member of the team. So for example, whoever the senior DBA is would be on the IRT, and whoever the senior network administrator is would be on the IRT. So you don't necessarily have to call out by, specific. You don't have to say John Smith and Deborah Adams are going to be on the team. That might not make a lot of sense if, you have some turnover. So here's an outline of what the charter would look like. You would start with your summary, like an executive summary. By the way, an executive summary, for those of you that haven't done this before, is not like a typical summary. When you're in grade school, you learn how to write a paper. You always start with a introduction, and then you have a body, and then you've got a summary at the end, right, or a conclusion at the end. And the idea was the first paragraph was the teaser to say this is what I'm going to talk about, and then the next 3 paragraphs would have to be what you're going to talk about, and then the last paragraph has to tie it all together and state your conclusion. Clearly state your conclusion. And I think all of us probably learned to write that way. But you have to actually flip that upside down when you're writing in business and when you're doing technical writing or expository writing. So you want to start with your conclusion. That summary is really a conclusion. So it kind of summarizes the entire document. We call it an executive summary. You can think of it as an executive doesn't have time to read the entire document. They're going to read the executive summary. It's going to tell them everything they need to know about what's in the document. Not just what's in the document, what the conclusions of that document are, what the specifics are. So the executive summary might be, we are forming an incident response team. Their goal is XYZ. Their mission is to, just a brief statement of the mission. The team's going to be made up of 16 people, from various departments, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't have to read the whole document to figure that out. But let's say they're reading the document and they say, okay, it says here that, there's a brief statement about the organizational structure, but I need to see more about that. They could kind of, leaf down through the document and say, okay, here we go. Here's more detail. And then they could go back to the executive summary, continue reading it, and say, oh, wait a second, I need to know something about their authority. They're saying something in here about the level of authority. Let me verify that. And then they can go look at the authority section. So that's really how an executive summary works. All of your policy documents would really be framed that way. And also, don't be afraid to use bullet points when you write these documents. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but when you write, these technical documents or procedural documents and things like that, narratives are great when you're writing a paper about elephants, but not so much when you're writing these policy documents. So continue with our charter. We start with that executive summary. We talk about our mission. Then we go into a mission statement, which is going to have our goals and the responsibilities for everybody in the team. And of course, is going to define, that team a little bit. It's going to talk about your incident declaration. So the definition of an incident and the process to declare an incident, who they're going to notify. Maybe it's a specific group of people. It could be, the help desk, whatever it is. The organizational structure of the incident response team will be stated in this charter. The roles and responsibilities for everyone on the team. So, here's the leader of the team. This person's going to be responsible for evidence or whatever it is. It's all going to be laid out in the roles and responsibilities. Information flow, meaning communications. So who's going to communicate with whom, how they're going to communicate, methods or how the goals are going to be achieved. So the methods are basically, okay, we've got these goals. How are we going to achieve those goals? So if one of the goals is the incident response team has to respond within 15 minutes of an incident being reported, you could talk about how that's going to happen. What's going to allow that to happen. And then authority and reporting, which is pretty important, just what the level of authority of the IRT is, and make sure that, and of course, because it's in this document, somebody's going to approve this document. So it's implied or it's implicit that that authority exists, that somebody, whoever is stated to have the authority over the IRT has the authority to do what we say in this document, has the authority to tell the DBA that you need to do X, Y, Z, or has the authority to notify legal counsel that there's something bad happening, or that we need to notify customers, and so forth and so on. And we already talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to kind of expand on this a little bit, we talked about classifying an incident. So we want to develop some kind of classification system. In our policy, we're going to have a policy about classifying an incident, about how we classify incidents, and some guidelines and standards for classifying incidents, depending on the industry type. So I gave you 5 possible classifications, and I think most industries would probably use all 5, and it certainly doesn't hurt to have all 5. You have to think about the legal and regulatory obligations when you think about these classifications. So you might want to have, for example, if there's unauthorized access to data, in my world, in the world of medical, that's a special category, because we know that we have to do some things for HIPAA. We have to possibly notify patients, and we have to take corrective action, and so forth and so on, to notify DHHS. You have to think about that when you're creating the classification. There might be some special handling that you have to do depending on what type of incident it is. Common approach that we talked about already is, you could say malicious code, denial of service, unauthorized access. These could all be classifications. I talked about some other ones as well, like network probing, and inappropriate use could also be one of the classifications. So inappropriate might be less severe than some of these, although sometimes inappropriate use could be rather severe, I suppose. And also major versus minor. Major incidents are significant, but you have to define what classifies something as a major incident. What is a big enough incident that it requires the activation of the incident response team? And that determination could be based on some objective analyzation of risk, right? So something, hopefully there's some way that we can objectively say, okay, we need to notify IRT at this point because it meets these specific requirements or qualifications. And sometimes, of course, it's going to be a judgment call, so we'll have to have guidelines on how people can make that call as to whether something should be declared as a major incident. And that's also kind of a cultural thing too. I'm going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of incident response now. Exactly what's happening in this whole cycle of an incident. And obviously, we have to start with discovery of an incident. So that's the first thing that happens. We discover there's an incident, which is step number 1. So in step number 1, we identify an incident, we open up an incident report, we activate the incident response team if required, and leadership might be notified. Again, if it's a big enough issue that we activate the IRT, then management is probably notified. So how do we know that there was an incident? What exactly is an incident? In your textbook, they talk about a couple different examples, such as suspicious activity of a coworker, and at the same time, you notice that some of the accounts are not balancing. So, somebody just seems like they're acting kind of shifty, and at the same time, maybe there's some money missing from accounts or something like that. That might start that incident investigation. An IDS might throw some kind of an error message, or it might throw some kind of warning that something is happening. IDSs are automated intrusion detection systems. So they're special software that sits on your network or on a host. There's host-based and network-based intrusion detection systems, and they're constantly monitoring what's going on, looking for patterns that indicate some kind of a breach. And if they start throwing alerts, then there's a good chance that there's some kind of a breach. So that might be another example. We all have antivirus on our computers. If one computer throws an antivirus alert, that's not a big deal. But if all of a sudden you just, in your antivirus software, you see it light up across the whole organization that everybody's getting hit with a certain virus, that might indicate some kind of an incident. So that might, that becomes a bigger deal. If 2 or 3 computers are getting a virus, no big deal. But if all of a sudden, 1,000 computers are reporting in the antivirus that they're getting hit with the virus, that's going to be a little bit more important to take a look at that. And along with that, users might complain that things are getting slow. If 1 or 2 users complain their computer is slow, not a big deal. That's a minor thing. But if an entire floor, an entire department, or an entire building or division is saying, hey, everything's running really slow right now, we can barely do our job, that certainly is going to be an incident. If somebody sees the file names that look funny, and I've had these incidents before where somebody says, I'm working in a hospital and they notice in the archive or something, where there should only be clinical data, all of a sudden there's some files with some weird characters or hidden files that somebody notices. And I can recall years ago, maybe 10 years ago, somebody, we were doing some investigating on why the network was very slow overnight, and come to find out, we're seeing there's a lot of traffic on the network overnight. We're trying to figure out why, and it was kind of paradoxical. Most organizations use their network during the day. In this case, this network was very important at night because they were sending X-ray images overseas to get read by doctors in Australia. So they had to have this really, fast internet connection at night to support that and to keep the ER open. And come to find out, we started finding these files with weird names, and it was, somebody hacked their server and was using it as an FTP server for software and movies and music and all kinds of stuff that shouldn't be on there. And we brought it up to the users, said, okay, we think we figured out what it was. People were using the server as a file server, and somebody said, oh, is that why there are all these files with funny names on them? Well, how long ago did you notice that? Oh, it was about 6 months ago we started seeing those files. Well, it would have been nice to know, right? So certainly something users could look for. But they might have reported that to somebody in IT, said, hey, how come there's some files in here with some strange names? And, they probably blew it off and said, I don't know, it's probably supposed to do that. But, that should have kicked off some kind of an investigation. If you see unknown local accounts or network accounts that shouldn't be there, if you see logs on a server that have been deleted, somebody's going in and deleting log entries or deleting logs, that's a good sign. That's one of the things you're going to do is if you break into a network, you're going to hide the evidence. You're going to remove the logs that you left behind, that you broke in. Multiple failed login attempts. And again, multiple failed login attempts on its own is not a big deal, but when you take it in aggregate, if it's happening a lot, then that's going to be an issue that has to be investigated. So step number one is we're going to discover and report that an incident is happening, or that an incident has happened. And again, in your policy, you're going to define how that happens. You're going to define, at least give some objective parameters somebody could use to define whether or not an incident is actually happening. So once we start, at some point, we're going to get to the point where we have to report that incident. One example or one technique that some people will use for reporting is to classify. We already talked about classifications of type of incidents, but you could also classify the severity. In our textbook, they give you a very simple system, severity number 1 through 4, where severity level 4 is a very low severity level, and severity level 1 is the highest, is the worst case scenario. So if something really bad is happening, you say it's a severity level 1. If it's not so bad, maybe a severity level 2, 3, or 4. So 4 would be a small number of systems affected by something, or a couple scans of a couple systems are detected, or something like that. Something that's isolated would be severity level 4. Maybe that wouldn't necessarily activate the entire IRT, but it would get documented, and folks would know that, hey, something needs to get looked at. Severity level 3 would be a significant number of systems affected, and severity level 2 might be something like a denial of service attack that's detected. So something that we know about, but we have to do something. And severity level 1 is a successful penetration. Somebody actually got in, took our data. We know they took some data, or they deleted data, or they did something. Somebody actually penetrated the network, and it's something that we seriously have to start doing some research and some investigation.
So once you determine what level the event is, severity level 1, 2, 3, or 4, if you're using those severity levels, the next step would be to to notify the incident response team if it meets the correct severity level. So, as an example, you might say in your incident response policy that severity level 4 and 3 are low enough priority that they don't activate the IRT. They might get logged or reported somewhere, but it's not going to activate a formal response. Whereas severity level 2 and level 1 may have to activate that leadership team. I'm sorry, the IRT. But the next thing is obviously notifying leadership, which is you have to tell leadership that we had an incident or we're currently having an incident. And at that time, that's when you may bring up to your leadership team whether or not you want to pursue the attacker or just lock down the attack to prevent any further damage. So one of the things that our book talks about doing as far as notifying leadership is having some protocol in place and making sure leadership understands that at some point they may be asked this question, what's the correct direction? And you would have to be able to, or whoever's activating the IRT and notifying leadership would have to somehow define for them what would happen if they decide to allow the attacker to continue in order to pursue the attacker. And of course, it depends on what type of attack it is. And I think in some cases it may make sense to let the attacker continue. Maybe in your policy you would talk about if the attack is clearly coming from the inside, then it becomes much more important to try to track down who it is because they're part of the organization. You need to find out who they are. So again, it becomes rather important at that point. So after we discover and report, the next step is going to be to contain the attack. So we want to stop the attack and we want to gather evidence. So stopping the attack could mean, simple things like changing the IP address. It could be deleting the user account or disabling the user account that's been attacked. We could be something drastic like taking the system offline until you can figure out how they got in there and how they're doing whatever it is they're doing, or removing some kind of software. It could be lots of different things. So whatever it is we need to do to stop the attack. So this is probably the important job of the IRT is in the moment is how do we contain this? How do we prevent this from continuing? So they're going to stop that attack, and at the same time, as a secondary to stopping the attack, you also want to be able to gather evidence. That way you can figure out what happened later on, and we'll talk about that later. So in this phase, you would also be doing the evidence gathering, which, of course, is important for a variety of reasons. But the one of the things about evidence gathering I should talk about is when you do evidence gathering, there's all kinds of guidelines for evidence gathering, and your book talks about it a little bit. But that kind of stuff should be codified in the policy like everything else. So you'll have some information in there about how to properly gather evidence and how you're going to log that evidence. And there's really two goals when you're gathering evidence. One is internal. You're gathering it internally so that you can analyze that evidence to figure out what happened and how do we prevent this from happening in the future. That's certainly one part of evidence. But the second part is if it does become an incident that has to get reported to the authorities, or if you're going to pursue an attacker in court, criminal or civil, it doesn't really matter, but there's going to be some important concerns about the chain of the evidence, or the chain of custody with evidence. So you might have to have some information on how your organization is going to handle chain of custody with computer evidence. So after we contain the attack, the next step is, okay, we pick ourselves up and we say, where are we? What do we need to recover our system? So the cleanup after the attack. And the goal here is to resume normal operations. So during the recovery phase, at this point the threat has hopefully been contained. And at this point you're bringing in your business continuity plan. So you're bringing that in to see, okay, what do I need to do to get back to where we were, to recover any lost data or any damaged data. You're going to during this phase as well, you're going to face a lot of pressure to get the systems back online at 100%. So during this phase, sometimes you have to try to slow down a little bit and see if you can gather any additional evidence. So during the containment phase, things are moving really fast. You're just trying to contain what's happening. You're trying to stop whatever it is that's happening if it's in progress, unless, of course, it already happened and it's done. You're trying to contain whatever it is that breached the network or breached a computer or data or what have you. But when we're in the cleanup phase, at this point, we're not worried about the continuation of the attack, but if you're thinking ahead, at some point you're going to have to try to figure out what happened. So during the cleanup phase, as you're bringing things back to where they were, your book talks about the idea of maybe imaging the systems that were affected so that you can take a snapshot of what it was like before you fixed everything and got it back to operational. That way you can go back and analyze it. You can kind of see what the conditions were at the time of the attack, when you contain that attack. So you could do something like that. But the important part is, during the cleanup phase, we have a lot more time to gather some additional evidence. So that may also happen during the cleanup phase. But the focus on the cleanup phase is recovery and resuming operations. So next, we're going to analyze and prevent further attacks. So during the analyze and attack phase, we're going to try to figure out what led up to the event. So what's the root cause of the event? What happened during the event? And then how effective was the response? Did we do the right thing? Did we make the right decisions? And we want to document all that. And it's one purpose, of course, is to learn for the future how to better respond to these events and how to better prevent these types of attacks. What would have prevented this attack? Another important part of the analyze phase is your book talks an awful lot at this point about chain of custody. So at this point, they're basically saying take whatever you gathered from the containment and cleanup phases, all this evidence that we gathered, and if there's a chance that this incident has to go to court, for example, if it's an inside job, an employee inside the company was responsible, and somehow you have to go after damages or something like that, or if it's an outside thing and they catch the person or the parties that are responsible for it, then you have to, in order to prove the damages to the company and who did it and how it happened, chain of custody becomes pretty important. So and basically chain of custody is it's a legal term. It's how evidence is documented and protected. So one of the examples they give you in the book is we all know about hash values. So if you take an image of a system, of a drive, you could do a hash on the, there's various hash algorithms, MD5, SHA-1, and so forth and so on. You could take you can make a fingerprint of that drive using a hash algorithm. And then if you ever give that, once you make that fingerprint and keep a copy of that, you make a forensic copy of that image, then you can take another copy of it and do whatever you want with it to do your analysis. But if somebody else, needs to, if in discovery or whatnot, if somebody else needs to look at that evidence, you can prove that is the exact copy, that it wasn't adulterated at the time that you gathered that evidence or took the image of that machine. And that works for any files. So any files you find, it could be a log file, all kinds of things. You can do an MD5 hash to verify, and you can document it somewhere, and so forth and so on. So you can take whole courses on forensic analysis, and it goes into much more detail. And your knowledge of those areas would be part of the policy. And of course, the policy itself, we've talked about this before, is not going to be specific. It's going to state that the goal is to securely collect the evidence and to maintain a chain of custody. So, that would be the policy level. And then at the standard and, the control standards and the technical standards, you would define what standards are out there or you'd make your own standards on, basically you would say, we're going to do an MD5 hash and we're going to log it in some database or something like that. And then in the procedural area, you would say, here's exactly how to do that. So again, that would be the chain of custody. And you would have some kind of an evidence log to verify all that. As far as analyzing the incident, you want to be able to, if you can, you're going to try to identify the attacker, what kind of tools may have been used to perpetrate the attack, what vulnerability was exploited. So, it could be that a system wasn't patched. It could be an existing vulnerability. It could be a zero-day vulnerability, maybe something new that nobody knows about that you have to contact your vendor. What was the result of the attack? Try to understand what the damage was. Sometimes it's hard to identify exactly what was, what was compromised in the attack, but that's an important part of the analyze process. And you want to come up with some kind of recommendation that would prevent this attack from happening again. So these would be security controls that you're going to recommend in the future. Could be, controls that for people or technology, but either way, some kind of control that would help prevent this from happening again. So once you fully understand what happened, you complete the analysis phase. At this point, you also have to document, what happened. You have to make changes. So if you make some kind of control recommendation, you have to document those changes. So your book talks about a couple things you might have to do. You might have to update your network diagram and your inventory to make sure that you've got a current diagram of everything. That everybody understands how everything's configured. Profile your network, so you're going to map network traffic by time of day to keep trending information, understand business processes, keep all the clocks synchronized to be sure that all of your log files are at the same timestamp. In other words, if you're trying to do it, and if you're trying to analyze logs, one of the issues you might have across disparate systems is if their times are all off by a couple minutes, milliseconds count in computing. So to correlate them, you have to offset these times when you're trying to compare different logs. So it's helpful if everything is synchronized at the same time. And the book talks about creating a knowledge base of threats. So create and maintain a library of threat scenarios. So you've got a place to look to learn, what's happening now. So if a future incident happens, you can say, hey, something like this happened before. How did it happen? And you can compare that to what's happening at that time. So the next phase is the report phase. So this is the final active phase of an incident. So everything we've talked about so far is all in relation to a specific incident that happened. It started with discovery and reporting. Then we tried to contain it. Then we cleaned up to get back to operations. And then we go back into our maybe back to our office, sort of close the door and analyze it and try to prevent it from happening in the future. And then finally, we have to report. So a couple things we have to report. One purpose of report is to obtain buy-in. So what we're trying to do is justify, hey, here's an attack that happened. We need to make some changes so this doesn't happen again. Maybe the change is stronger passwords, as an example. So it doesn't have to be financial buy-in. So somebody could say, well, we figured out that the attacker was able to crack the passwords because they were too simple. We had users that were using passwords that were just words. And, maybe the users have always done that because it's easy to remember. They don't want to have to change it all the time. And, whatever it is, you've got a really lax password policy. Well, somebody broke into the network. Now we have the evidence. We've got the justification to go back and say, hey, those really easy passwords? Well, this is why somebody was able to get into our network. So now it's time for us to change that policy. So that would help you obtain buy-in, the report. So, sort of this final report that you deliver in general would tell people, hey, this is how the attack happened. The attacker we saw was using some kind of brute force. It only took 465 attempts, and they figured out what the password was. That's, ridiculously low number of attempts. So we need to make a change. You've got to, possibly advise the public. So if during the event you're required to advise the public, or, it was the right thing to do, or it was good for PR to advise people what was going on. So if there was for example, a loss of service, or people were not able to access your services, obviously you're going to notify users of that somehow. So when the incident's over, you have to tell the public that, hey, we figured out what the problem was. Here's what it is. And of course, you don't want to give away, all the secrets. You don't want to say exactly how the attack happened. You don't want to give somebody an idea of how they can attack a network, quite possibly. Although some people like to do that to try to force some hardening of networks in general in the industry. So that's, of course, a judgment call. but you're going to tell the public what happened, how you solved the problem, and a lot of that is building confidence. If your users were down for a period of time, they may be feeling like, hey, can I really trust these guys with my data? Can I really trust this service is always going to be online? So if you advise the public exactly what happened, I think people are more willing to accept that there was some downtime and, hey, things happen. There's nothing you can do about it. So, but at least it was handled and it was solved. They know what it was, and they can, and maybe some information about how you're going to prevent that from happening in the future. We've made some changes, and we're reasonably sure that this isn't going to happen again. And you're going to close the incident. So you officially at that point close the incident. And then the final phase in the cycle, which is sort of outside the a single incident, is planning and training. So obtaining funding to do planning and training, updating the charter over time. If you have to make changes to the IRT, you want to train your users and do awareness training periodically. And this goes back to awareness training and all that stuff we talked about before with the user domain. But this is a part of the incident response cycle because this is going to help prevent incidents from happening in the future. So once we understand what the incident was, how it happened, at that point we can start training users about how we're going to prevent that in the future. And a lot of incidents are not technical in nature. Many incidents are a result of social engineering, things like that. So that requires a lot of training for the users to understand how they, can prevent these social engineering attacks where somebody talked to somebody and convinced them to give them the password or convince them to give them their RSA key or something like that. So, you might do some role playing or something to demonstrate how the attacker was able to trick someone into giving them some critical information. And sometimes the information seems benign, but, it's that last piece of information that the attacker needs in order to crack the network, in order to break into the network. So awareness training is certainly an important part of the cycle. And the next time an incident happens, we start all over again. So it's a cyclical thing. We're going to keep going through this cycle every time something happens, and we're always going to come back to that planning and training. We already talked a little bit about IRT members, so I'll expand on this just a little bit. So who makes up the incident response team? And again, this is something that that would be part of the charter. So the policy would be, of course, we need an IRT and the reasons why and so forth and so on. And the charter itself would define some of this. So the first part is users, or the people on the front line. These are the people that are supporting the front end, and they may be the ones that are going to detect an issue first. I gave you the example earlier about the hospital I was working at, where users saw these files with funny names, but they didn't report it. They never told anyone. So a lot of times you're relying on the users. The earlier the users can detect a breach or detect an incident, the sooner you can start containing it, and the sooner you can bring operations in it. It won't blow out of control. So users are certainly on the front line, and there may be some users that are part of this IRT team. System administrators, of course, because they can they understand their systems and they can analyze those threats. They can make recommendations on how to contain the threat, so they're going to know what ports to block. They're going to know, they're intimately familiar with what user accounts need to get, could be compromised, and what services need to be stopped and things like that. So they're going to know all that stuff, and they're also going to know how to go back and try to figure out what happened. So they're an integral part of the incident response team. They're also going to know exactly what to do recovery. So they're going to know what their options are for recovery. They're going to know where to go to get, backup copies and things like that. And again, a lot of this could also be in the business continuity plan. Obviously, IS security. So they're going to be performing the actual IRT activities, which we've talked about. So all this stuff that we've talked about, obviously somebody in information system security would be involved with that. They may be coordinating these efforts. They may be assisting the system administrators, taking the complaints from the users in the front line as for possible incidents and things like that. Management is the authority. So they're not only the authority to the organization, but they're also, they're basically giving the IRT the authority to do their job. They're saying, hey, the incident response team has the authority to go out and tell the system administrators what should be done, things like that. So they're establishing the authority of the IRT, and they're the ones making key decisions as we're trying to decide what we need to do. So if we have to decide whether to contain or allow an attack to continue in order to try to catch who it is, or if we have to decide if we're going to notify the public, if we have to decide which regulatory agencies we need to notify, management's going to be involved with all that. Support services. So this might be the help desk. They're going to be on the front line. They're going to be the ones that are probably going to report the majority of incidents or start to see the evidence that an incident is happening. The IRT manager is going to be the one that interfaces with management, and they're typically the one coordinating all these efforts. Or you could have an IRT coordinator, somebody whose job it is to coordinate all these different efforts across the organizational boundaries. So, coordinating all these different departments, or, I've just talked about all these different people. We've got users, system administrators, IS security, management, support services. So the coordinator could coordinate all that. Or, on our IRT, I talked about how it's a cross-functional team, and the coordinator would be coordinating, and we talked about these different approaches. So you've got the on-site approach, where the IRT team are the people, clicking the keyboards. And then I talked about this idea that it could be, representatives from different divisions that all make up the IRT, and the coordinator is coordinating all that during an incident and throughout that entire incident life cycle. All right, this is our last slide, so we're almost done. Some best practices in incident response. So your book talks about some best practices. The effectiveness of the IRT and its related policies needs to be measured. So like anything else, it's good to have goals, and it's good to be objective, be able to objectively say that, hey, the incident response team is doing its job, and it's having an impact on the organization. It's a worthwhile investment, et cetera, et cetera. So the book talks about publishing annually to comparison for prior years. And that comparison could be things like how many incidents there were. So from year to year, you could talk about the number of incidents, and maybe the same incidents reoccurring, how often that happens, some metrics that can help you define the effectiveness of the IRT. So the measurement should include the goals from the IRT Charter. So in your IRT Charter, you stated a bunch of goals. So you want to report on those goals that were from the Charter. Any additional analytics to indicate the reduction of risk to the organization. So some examples of that: the number of incidents, the number of repeat incidents, which I just talked about, how long it took to contain each incident. So if that number is going down, that's a good thing. So if, as the IRT, gets more and more proficient, you should see that number go down for the time to contain the incident. They get better at coordinating efforts. They get better at analyzing. They get better at all that stuff. So, hopefully we're learning over time. And then finally, the financial impact of the organization. So, you could say that in year one, we lost an estimated, $400,000 to incidents. It could be, a combination of all the possible incidents: people walking out with data, the loss of intellectual property, data leakage, lawsuits from data being released, the cost of notifying the public and things like that when there's an incident, maybe loss of business because of downtime on a website or something like that. And then over time, you could say, our incident response team, you could objectively say that based on the reduction of incidents, it can account for this much increase in revenue. So you can draw that correlation. And of course, that all goes back to justifying all this. Obviously, if management and the organization doesn't see a use for the IRT, then their implied importance is going to drop. Some people's perception of IRT and of really IT security in general is going to be decreased. So it's important to make sure people are aware of what you're doing and what's happening. And sometimes I think as IT people, it's hard for us to do this. It's hard for us to, to get ourselves in front of the organization and say, hey, we're doing something. It's a lot of times we're kind of working in the background. The fact that people don't know that we're there is usually a good thing. When people don't really think about it, it just works. It's like my water department. I never think about how complicated it is that every time I turn the faucet on in my house, water comes out of the faucet. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it that, that for the last 100 years, just about every house in this country, when you turn on the faucet, water comes out, and it's always clean. It's always at a pretty consistent pressure, no matter where you go. It's pretty important, and you never really think about that. You never really think about the complexities to deliver that. And I think IT can kind of be the same thing. It's this amazingly complex, network of computers with all these interoperable software packages and things all kind of coordinated in a complex Rube Goldberg machine almost, but it works. And, it doesn't take much to bring that down. So, incident response is important because it's going to help prevent those types of attacks, but it's good that we can let people know that, hey, this isn't easy, and this is what we're doing to keep all this stuff working. So people are aware of that. Kind of like the newsletter I get from the water department every once in a while, talking about what they're doing to keep our water clean, and where they're sourcing all of the water and things like that. So that's it. This is the conclusion of Unit 8 about incident response. If you have any questions, by all means, please reach out to me. Thank you.